The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Welcome back to another episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Or if you're new here, thank you for taking a chance on the show and tuning in for the first time. This is a podcast dedicated to all things strange but true, and today's topic is something I've wanted to cover for ages. It's a subject that absolutely fascinates me. So today we're going to be taking a closer look at the psychological phenomenon known as hero complex, otherwise called hero syndrome or sometimes even Saviour Complex. Not only are we going to be exploring what it is, but I'm also going to tell you about some of the more bizarre cases in which this phenomenon has played out too. A couple of very quick disclaimers before we start. And I know I always say this before these kinds of stories, but it's important to make clear that I am not a doctor, a psychologist, or any kind of medical professional. My degree is in journalism, not psychology, and everything I'm going to be saying today is simply filtered through my own understanding based on the reading and research I've done. Also, there will be mentions of mental health conditions within this episode, so do keep all of that in mind before we begin. That said, let's get into this fascinating topic. When it comes to the subject of the hero complex, there are a couple of things that are vital to say from the outset. First and foremost, it's important to note right up front that this phenomenon is not actually an official, recognised psychological condition. It's more of a behaviour or an attitude, rather than something a person can be formally diagnosed with. It's something that a fair few psychologists have spoken about, but not necessarily deeply studied. So for this reason, I've kind of taken everything I've read about this topic with a little pinch of salt, or at least considered the information to be theoretical rather than strictly factual, and I would recommend that you do the same. And the second thing I wanted to highlight right up front is that the term, and its alternate variations, are often used in three different ways. You'll sometimes hear people referring to those who try their best to help others at all costs as having a bit of a hero complex, and these references are often fairly positive. They're usually implying that the person experiencing this unofficial syndrome is selfless to a fault, putting everyone else's needs before their own. But this side of the topic isn't really what we're going to be focusing on today. The second type of behaviour often mentioned in relation to the complex is around those who more actively seek out those who are in distress in order to kind of swoop in and become this knight in shining armour. The psychologist Dr. Ramon Ford had this to say about this element of the Saviour complex. Quote, "If you're compelled to save other people, you're always looking for the bird with a broken wing. You're prime for when people are down on their luck because it helps to build your need and fulfill that compulsion to save others." What I interpret this to mean is that, unlike the first usage where the person is being selfless, this behaviour is possibly more selfish. The heroic action you're doing is rooted in boosting your own self-esteem, and the positive impact on the recipient of your action is sort of secondary. But the third usage of this term is a lot more serious, and you'll soon realise why I've chosen this angle as the focus of today's episode, because it relates to the idea that some of those with a hero complex can actually be narcissists, or at least have narcissistic tendencies, and fulfill their need to be seen as a hero via much more nefarious methods, including, in the most extreme circumstances, purposefully creating dangerous situations in order to jump in and become a saviour. So, plot twist, this episode is going to sit far more on the true crime side of things than you may have expected. Let's begin by heading back to the mid-1980s, when the term hero syndrome first started gaining traction in the media, following a bizarre incident at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. On the 13th of August that year, the day after the games had drawn to a close and the teams were preparing to make their way home, a shocking incident took place against the backdrop of an otherwise peaceful tournament. After a bus carrying the luggage of the Turkish Olympic team arrived at the LA International Airport, a waiting police officer spotted something odd in one of the wheel wells, and after he investigated it, he discovered a ticking pipe bomb. The officer, James Wade Pearson, who was 40 years old at the time, wasted no time after finding the device. According to the Washington Post, he, quote, pulled out one of its wires and carried it 60 yards across the tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport. After doing so, he was immediately hailed as a hero. The LA police chief, Daryl Gates, described Pearson's move as a hell of a courageous act, and he was universally acknowledged as the man who had saved the day. That was until just the next day, when Pearson's colleagues in the police force started to suspect something was a bit off. All of the buses had been carefully examined before they had left to go to the airport. The Washington Post reported at the time that, quote, before the alleged discovery of the device at 5:45 p.m., Olympic security officials had examined the luggage bus and an accompanying bus carrying 52 Turkish athletes, and watched for attempts to approach the buses before they reached the airport. When investigators also learned that Pearson had experience with explosives, their suspicion continued to mount, and when the officer got wind of this, he actually volunteered to do a polygraph test to demonstrate that his act of heroism had been just that. But this is where things began to unravel for him. After failing the test, it seems that Pearson got cold feet about his ruse. He actually ended up admitting to not only planting the bomb, but building it in his van a few days prior, all in an attempt to look like a hero and get himself noticed by his superiors, as he was angling after a transfer away from his current role where he didn't get along with his supervisor. After pleading guilty to the crime, he only ended up receiving a sentence of 5 years probation, plus 1,500 hours of community service and a $10,000 fine. But the real legacy of this incident was that the public had now been exposed to this newly coined term, hero syndrome. At this point, I have somewhat of a footnote to add to the very first disclaimer I made in this episode, which is that hero syndrome is not a diagnosable condition. And whilst that is true, it does appear that the behaviour is noteworthy enough that the FBI have actually developed what they call profiles for it. Jim Wright, the renowned former FBI profiler, was one of those who spent decades analysing criminal behaviours and was a leading expert in cases suspected to involve hero complex or hero syndrome. Later in his career, he started working with the Threat Assessment Group, who specialised in helping to prevent violence in the workplace, and was supervised by the legendary forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. And Dr. Dietz has occasionally used another term to describe those who commit unlawful acts in the name of swooping in and being the hero, vanity crimes, which I thought was a fascinating term, because when you think about it, there is a correlation there. If a person was desperate enough to be seen as a hero that they'd break the law in the process, I think it's reasonable to say that this is a very vain act. We're going to revisit this FBI angle a little later on, as the profiles concerning hero syndrome have not always produced accurate results. But for now, I wanted to look at a few more of the crimes that have been linked with the hero complex. Now, when I've mentioned to people in my life that I was covering this topic for today's episode, almost all of them said the same thing in relation to the true crime aspect, and that was, oh, like the angel of death cases. And they're partially correct. So if you're not familiar with it, angel of death is a somewhat controversial term that most often refers to instances where a nurse or doctor or other medical professional has been found to have unlawfully killed a patient in their care, with their defense being that it was out of mercy. But there is another, rarer occasion when this term is used, and that is in cases where the doctor or nurse has created a medical issue in a patient in order to solve it, and you guessed it, be seen as the hero. There are numerous examples we could look at here, but I'm going to tell you about one of the most infamous, and that is the convicted killer Richard Angelo. During the 1980s, Angelo was a nurse at the Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, New York. On paper, he was every bit the kind of person you'd expect to dedicate their life to helping others. He was a volunteer firefighter and a former Eagle Scout who excelled in his studies before qualifying as a nurse. But the reality was tragically very different. Before the decade was out, he would be convicted of the murders of 4 of his patients, although it's suspected he could be responsible for the deaths of over 30 others. And what's more, he actually confessed to some of his crimes, as well as revealing the reasons why he decided to commit them, saying, quote, "I wanted to create a situation where I would cause the patient to have some respiratory distress or some problem, and through my intervention or suggested intervention or whatever, come out looking like I knew what I was doing. I had no confidence in myself. I felt very inadequate." He was only caught because a patient of his named Gerolamo Kucic noticed Angelo behaving suspiciously and thought the nurse might have added an unknown medication into his IV drip. Gerolamo acted quickly, raising the alarm to other members of staff, and by doing so he not only saved his own life, but potentially and more than likely the lives of future innocent patients. Angelo was apprehended, and although 2 psychologists declared he was suffering from a dissociative identity crisis, the prosecution at his trial argued that he was simply a monster who wanted to appear as though he was a hero. He was found guilty on numerous charges, including 2 counts of second-degree murder, and was sentenced to a minimum term of 50 years in prison. Then, in an eerily similar and long-running case which first came to light in Germany back in 2005, it emerged that a nurse named Niels Hogel had gained the nickname Rescue Rambo at work because he always ended up being the first person on hand to help resuscitate patients who went into unexplained cardiac arrest on the ward. Like Richard Angelo, Hogel would administer medication to his patients which would put them into a dangerous state before he rushed in to quote-unquote save them, but they could not always be revived. In 2018, whilst he was already in prison serving a life term for the unlawful killings of 6 of his patients, he faced an additional trial in which he admitted to murdering around 100 further patients. And it gets worse because since that time, it's believed the real total could be more towards 300. It's genuinely unthinkable and would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in the world. Unsurprisingly, Hogel will spend the rest of his days in prison. At this point, and before we move on to the next section, I did just want to make it clear that cases like this are very, very rare. The overwhelming majority of nurses and doctors are amazing human beings, and I have a huge amount of respect for them. But like in any profession, there will naturally always be a very small number of people who are not good humans. It's just that in a medical setting, those with bad intentions have the potential to cause a lot more harm than they would in a different professional field. And the same goes for the next subtopic within the overall hero syndrome realm. A phenomenon within a phenomenon, if you will, because something that's often discussed in articles about the hero complex is firefighter arson. And we actually have some really interesting research to look at here. So in 2003, over in the US, there was a federal study conducted where researchers looked into the cases of 75 different firefighters who had committed arson. Here's what the New York Times described in terms of the study findings. This is fascinating. Quote, "They wanted the excitement of putting out a blaze. The arsonists were usually new to the profession with about 3 years' experience, and they tended to be volunteers rather than full-time paid employees. They were interested in fire service for excitement, not for the sake of public service, the report stated. And this is backed up by something that's noted later in the New York Times piece, which is a quote from criminologist Michael Rustigan from San Francisco State University, who spoke about his belief that most, quote, self-created heroes are narcissists in a slump. He added that they are typically people who are not able to achieve their aspirations. They've fallen down and now they want to be heroes. They are a manifestation of our culture's obsession with fame. That last part really stood out to me. I'm so intrigued to know what he would make of this topic now in 2025, with the prevalence of social media and how it impacts people's behaviour. That's a whole other subject, I suppose, and one that would probably make an interesting episode in itself. But for now, let's go back to firefighter arson. In what's becoming a running theme for this episode, it's important to note that not all firefighter arsonists fall within the hero syndrome bracket, because some of them, like probably the most infamous of all, John Leonard Orr, don't end up rushing to the rescue and putting out the fires they start. They're more motivated by causing chaos and destruction rather than saving the day. But there is some crossover. One case that had truly devastating consequences is that of Caleb Lacey. In 2009, Lacey was just 19 years old and working as a volunteer firefighter when he made a terrible decision that would land him in prison with a sentence of 25 years to life. For this story, we take our second visit this episode to Long Island, New York, where Lacey had grown frustrated after answering 90 different emergency calls, yet hadn't ended up at the scene of a single active fire. In what's believed to have been a desperate bid to finally be seen as a hero, he deliberately started a fire in the stairwell of an apartment block near to his own home. The apartments were located above a laundrette, and for those living on the second floor, that stairwell was the only way in or out of the building, as for some reason, the fire escape had previously been removed from the complex. After he started the fire, Lacey sprung into action. Before the emergency was even called in, he had dashed to the fire station, put on all of his protective gear, and waited for his team to be summoned to the scene. Although in the end, he wasn't actually allowed into the burning building when he got there. He was too junior for that, so he assisted the other firefighters from outside. But their efforts would not be enough to prevent tragedy. Although some residents had been able to escape by jumping from windows, 46-year-old Morena Venegas and 3 of her children sadly perished in the blaze. My blood ran cold when I first heard about this story. It's just unimaginable. After his suspicious behavior was clocked, Lacey was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder and manslaughter plus arson, and he ended up being convicted on all charges, with the judge in the case noting that his actions had been the result of a twisted bid to become a hero. It is just terrible. If there was ever a story that should be used as a deterrent, a warning to anyone with an idea like this that it should never ever be acted upon, this is surely it. It's completely heartbreaking. There are several other cases that are quite similar to Lacey's, involving firefighter arson with a deadly end result. And in many of these situations, the perpetrator explained that their motive was to gain recognition or a promotion at work, as well as the hero aspect, which of course draws parallels with the LA Olympics bomb threat case too. So there definitely seem to be some common threads running through these very rare incidents. Now, I wanted to loop back to the FBI profiles regarding hero complex or hero syndrome that I mentioned earlier, and tell you about one instance where this research really fell down and resulted in a true hero being mislabeled as a criminal. And once again, this situation involves the Olympic Games. Just another strange detail for you there. On the 26th of July 1996, at the Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, Atlanta, Georgia, a pipe bomb, again like I mentioned earlier, was discovered during the Summer Games being held at the site. It was found by an off-duty police officer named Richard Jewell, who was working as a security guard at the event, and upon discovering the bomb, Richard quickly began to evacuate the area, where a large crowd happened to be gathered. Unfortunately, the device did end up detonating, tragically killing one woman and injuring over 100 other attendees at the park. This is a horrible outcome, of course, but without Richard's swift thinking, it's fair to assume that the death toll would have been much, much higher. But nonetheless, the FBI began to look at him with suspicion. In fact, they actually went as far as publicly naming him as a suspect in the attack, saying, quote, "If Jewell did plant the bomb, the case would fit a well-established hero syndrome profile." The problem was that Richard was completely innocent. Not only did he have nothing to do with the bomb, but he had acted in a genuine, heroic manner that had prevented a much larger tragedy. In my opinion, the long and the short of it is that the FBI had been way too eager to find the bomber, and because of this, they'd been much too surface level in their profiling of Richard. As it turned out, the true culprit was Eric Robert Rudolph, the man responsible for carrying out not only the Olympic Park bombing, but 3 subsequent attacks too. When Rudolph was eventually caught and convicted, Richard Jewell was completely exonerated and received significant compensation from both media outlets and the federal government for the damage to his reputation, and rightly so, of course. Can you imagine doing something as selfless as staying behind to evacuate a bomb threat site and then being treated like a criminal afterwards? I'm very glad that Richard was able to be vindicated and have the record set straight. And I suppose that all of this leads me to the final couple of points I wanted to explore today. So we touched on this briefly at the very beginning, but I wanted to come full circle back to the question of why some people may become involved in this hero complex behavior on the extreme and at times criminal end of things. I noted earlier that some psychologists believe that hero syndrome and narcissism can sometimes go hand in hand. And on this point, I have a quote I wanted to share with you from NeuroLaunch, who compiled a piece about the topic based on numerous psychology essays and articles. They said, "The hero complex in narcissistic individuals often has its roots in childhood experiences. Maybe they grew up in a household where love was conditional, only given when they performed or achieved. Or perhaps they had to step into a caretaker role too early, becoming the hero of their family. Trauma and insecurity play a big role too. It's like these experiences create a perfect storm, pushing someone to develop a hero narcissist persona as a way to cope. They might think, if I can just save everyone else, maybe I can save myself too." And whilst this insight is fascinating, the article also echoed the point I've made several times within this episode, which is that there should always be a distinction made between those who are genuinely selfless and altruistic and those who have ill intentions. Another thing I feel it's important to say is that just because someone had the experiences mentioned in that quote, for example, growing up feeling like love was conditional or being a child in a caretaker role, it doesn't mean that that person will become narcissistic or develop a hero complex as an adult. I took the quote to be referring to certain specific cases, and perhaps cases more in that middle ground as well, instances that aren't quite as extreme as some of the ones we've discussed today. And remember that ultimately this behaviour is not an officially recognised condition and hasn't been widely researched enough yet. So again, do take all of this with a pinch of salt. Throughout all of the reading I've done in preparation for this episode, there was one thing that just stuck in my head, a detail that kept on nagging at me. It was a paragraph written in an educational paper put together by the Arkansas State Police, penned by Sergeant Ben D. Cross. In it, he hypothesizes that the numbers put forward by Dr. Park Dietz around how many security guards, law enforcement officers, firefighters, and medical professionals end up in this band of extreme criminal hero complex behaviour per year are actually, quote, grossly underestimated. And this, he says, is for a few simple reasons. It brings bad press to their workplace, it makes their superiors look bad, and it raises questions about the adequacy of their training. Of course, I think this should only be taken as a pure theory, but it's an intriguing one to contemplate nonetheless. Naturally, I truly hope this isn't the case, but I think there's a compelling argument there that more research into it probably needs to be done. In recent years, here in the UK, the term hero complex has cropped up in the media coverage and social media commentary relating to a couple of different cases, most notably that of Lucy Letby. And something I've noticed, especially in the Letby case, is that the very mention of hero complex can often prompt fierce debate. On one hand, some experts are quite matter-of-fact about it, like criminology professor David Wilson. He wrote a piece about Letby for the Guardian newspaper, in which he said, quote, "So why did she do it? We might never be able to answer this question definitively, but like many of those nurses who have been convicted in the past 50 years, there was probably a hero complex at work, a desire to be the center of everyone's attention, a toxic narcissism that demanded that they should have power and control, which they might have felt had been denied to them in other aspects of their lives. And what better way of demonstrating that power than deciding who should live and who should die?" But then, on the other hand, some feel that the term is being used as an excuse of sorts for unthinkable criminal actions, and others argue that it's merely a notion rather than a medical term, both of which are fair points. But what it's harder to deny is that the deeper you look into the hero complex, the more you want to learn about it. I believe that this is a phenomenon that will continue to pique the interests of those in the fields of psychology, true crime, and beyond. Well, this episode took me so much longer to research than I anticipated, but I was captivated by what I was reading from start to finish. It's so tricky with topics like this where there's not a huge amount to go on, but I really hope you found it as interesting as I did. I'm going to add some links to a few resources in the show notes, specifically mental health resources, as I always like to do when I'm covering these kinds of subjects. I am so intrigued to know whether you'd heard about the more sinister side of the hero complex or hero syndrome before. I know that often these kinds of terms, along with narcissist, for example, get thrown around quite freely, but in my view that's probably just another reason why this topic should be studied further, for it to be understood on a deeper level. I really can't wait to hear your thoughts and read your comments about this episode, and as always I'll be letting you know about all of the ways you can get in touch shortly. But first, you know what time it is. Let's head on over to our regular outro feature. Here's Weird Media. For Weird Media today, I was so determined to recommend something other than a TV series because I know we've been heavy on those lately, but I'm afraid I have failed, although I promise you it's worth it, because I have just finished watching my favourite Netflix find of the year so far without a doubt. I'm talking about the spectacular Department Q. If you love a good detective thriller or an underdog story or a murder mystery, this is the show for you. Although it's based on the Danish book series by author Jussi Adler-Olsen, the Netflix show is actually set in Edinburgh and follows troubled detective Carl Mork as he navigates a particularly difficult chapter in his life and his career. I never like to give too much away plot-wise, but the general premise is this. After a string of unfortunate events lead to Detective Mork being given a new cold case department to manage, himself and a few chosen colleagues decide to look into a fascinating missing persons file, and this forms the basis of this first series. That's all I'm going to tell you about what happens because I don't want to spoil anything. But you know when you're watching a show and you can just tell it's based on a book because everything is so well thought out and clever and properly developed? That's how I felt about Department Q the whole way through. The performances are next level, the writing is fantastic, the whole cast is phenomenal, and the characters are just genius. If you do watch it, I challenge you not to become completely enthralled by Akram, Rose, and even Carl himself too. It took all of my self-control not to Google the show as I was watching it to find out whether a second series has been confirmed. I always try to avoid doing that before I finish a show because I don't want to risk spoilers, and from what I can tell, there's no official news about a series 2 yet. But I really believe, or at least I really hope, that there will be. In my eyes, it could run for years, in a similar way to programs like Slow Horses has, or even the way Line of Duty did. I could not get enough of Department Q, and if you decide to check it out, I hope you love it just as much as I did. Right, I'm going to whiz through our sore shout-outs as there were quite a few. We had the Hero Syndrome paper from the Arkansas State Police by Sergeant Ben D. Cross, an article from the Cleveland Clinic about the Saviour Complex published on the 24th of September 2024, that Neuro Launch piece which was fascinating, that one was from the 6th of December 2024. We had a fantastic article from the New York Times about Hero Complex within the police force, that was by Damien Cave from August 2004, plus another great article from Psychology Today about quote-unquote hero serial killers by Catherine Ramsland PhD from June 2016. We had a piece from the LA Times about the Olympic bomb hoax. That was by Paul Feldman from all the way back in July 1985, as well as a Washington Post piece about the same story by Jay Matthews from August 1984, an NBC News piece about Caleb Lacey by Frank Eltman from April 2010, an article from the BBC about Niels Hogel that was published in October 2018, and finally the piece by Professor David Wilson in The Guardian that was published in August 2023. And as always, here's a speedy rundown of all of the ways you can get in touch. Our username on Instagram and Threads is @ThingsGetWeirdPodcast. On TikTok, we are @ThingsAreAboutToGetWeird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. On there, you'll find both our main page and our private discussion group too, which is free to join and you're all very welcome there. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you've enjoyed this episode, a super quick rating or review wherever you're listening would be very much appreciated. It's one of the very best things you can do to support the show, and I'm incredibly grateful for every single rating and review. A massive thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in today, and I will be back very soon with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.